Welcome back, everybody, to another week of Sunday school here at the Lighthouse Church of the Nazarene in Moravia, Iowa. We are going through the book of Esther. We just started last week. We in Esther chapter 1. What's the book of Esther about? Well, the book of Esther shows what it was like for the Jews who remained in Persia and did not go to Jerusalem with Zerubbabel to build the second temple, to rebuild Solomon's temple. The events of the book of Esther, they actually take place in the book of Ezra between chapter 6 and chapter 7, right around 480 BC. So last week in Esther chapter 1, what happened? Well, King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, threw this huge party, a 6-month long party. And at the end of it, when they were all drunk, he called for his queen, Queen Vashti, to come out so that he could parade her beauty in front of everybody. But what did the queen tell the king? Nope, I'm not coming out. This had never happened before. The queen had never told the king, no, or I'm not going to do what you say. So the whole kingdom's in an uproar. So the king and all his servants decide, what should we do? Well, they decided they were going to banish Queen Vashti and then make a decree that every man is the master of his own house. That it took a law, a decree to say that the men are masters of their house. So that's what happened last week in Esther chapter 1. We're just going to continue right there. This week we're in Esther chapter 2. Let's get out our Bibles and let's follow along. Esther chapter 2 verse 1. After these things. Well, what are all these things? Well, all the events of chapter 1, but also we know that there's actually a 4-year gap between the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. So many times in the Bible, just from one verse to the next, there can be a span of 20 years or a whole generation. So we know there's actually 4 years between chapter 1 and chapter 2. And what happened during those 4 years? Well, the king, he actually waged an unsuccessful war against Greece. And he's come back and now he's licking his wounds. Now, also, some people might say, well, what happened to Queen Vashti? We don't know. Some people say that Queen Vashti is also known by another name, a mistress, who actually became the queen mother of Artaxerxes after Ahasuerus is assassinated, because he will be assassinated 14 years later, this king that we're following right now. So some people think that Vashti is also known as a mistress. You can look that up for yourself. I don't know. But anyway, after these things, what are those things? A failed war against Greece, 4 years. Now he's come home and he's licking his wounds and he has to decide what he wants to do. So after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Now remember, we know this from the book of Daniel, Babylonian Persian laws. Once a law was made, could they rebuke it? No, it was finalized. So verse 2, then the king's servants who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom. Do you remember how many provinces there were from last week? 127. This is a massive kingdom here. Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Haggai the king's eunuchs, custodian of the women. And let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. So the king's basically surrounded himself with a bunch of yes men who just want their boss to be in a good mood. Could you imagine the staff meeting where this took place? Hey, let's just gather all the most beautiful women we can find and we'll bring them to you and you can have your pick of them. The king's probably like, oh, great idea, guys. So he's pretty much having a Miss Persia contest here where the judge gets to sleep with all the contestants. So they're going to go up around and gather all these women up. We don't know the customs of the times, whether these families would have wanted their women to be in the king's harem, but I'm guessing probably not. And I'm guessing most of these young women who are gathered up were more forced into it than their families were excited to give them up here. But that's what's going on. Verse 5, in Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Yair, the son of Shemaiah, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. Verse 7, and Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So we're actually introduced to two of the main characters in the book of Esther, Mordecai and Mordecai's cousin, Esther, who was a young orphan girl. Her parents died. So Esther's cousin Mordecai raised her up as his own. The third main character in the book of Esther is going to be Haman, we will be introduced to him next week. So Mordecai. Mordecai is actually not a Hebrew name. It's a Persian name, probably named after the Persian god Marduk. And we see that name Marduk in the Bible. If you go to the book of Jeremiah 50 verse 2, you'll see that name Marduk in there, a Babylonian Persian god, little g. Notice he was from the tribe of Benjamin. Kish must be a common name from that tribe of Benjamin. You remember King Saul, Israel's first king, he was from the tribe of Benjamin, and he was the son of Kish. So Mordecai, Esther's cousin, raised her as his own. Now we also have Esther. Esther, that's a Persian name. It means star. What's her Hebrew name? Hadassah. Hadassah actually means myrtle tree, which is a beautiful tree with a beautiful flower on it. And what do we know about Esther? We know she was a little orphan girl and that she was raised by her uncle. You notice here, verse 7, and Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. A lot of translations say she had a good figure and was beautiful to behold. I take this more to say lovely and beautiful. We think that sounds like a redundancy, the same thing, but I actually take it to mean more that maybe she was beautiful on the inside as much as she was on the outside. There are people who are beautiful on the outside, but they're really ugly on the inside, are they not? Proverbs 31:30 says, charm is deceitful and beauty fades, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. And that's why I kind of look at Esther here. When it says she was lovely and beautiful, she had inner beauty and not just outer beauty. So let's keep going here. Verse 8. So it was, when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken into the king's palace, into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. So all the women are gathered up. Now Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that there was actually 400 young virgins gathered up for this Miss Persia contest right here. One thing we have to remember when we're reading Josephus or talking about something Josephus said, Josephus wrote after the life of Jesus. I believe it was in around 90 AD when Josephus was writing. So this took place 480 BC. So, Josephus is writing 600 years after the fact. So where did he get his facts? I'm sure passed down by Jewish tradition. So, but I'll go with it. Josephus says that there was actually 400 young women gathered for this. If there was 127 provinces, that's 4 or less from each province. That's not too hard to believe. Verse 9. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor. So he readily gave beauty preparations to her besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. So she got the penthouse, the suites. Esther rose to the top right off the bat. We see this a lot throughout the Bible of God's chosen ones. Daniel, he ended up in Babylon. He went right to the top. Joseph in Egypt, he went right to the top. Nehemiah, he had an important position in God's kingdom. Not only was she beautiful, there was something about her that appealed to people that, some part of her character that people loved. My guess would be humility. Humility is something that people love. Proverbs 22:29 says, do you see a man who excels in his work? He will stand before kings. I'd like to think that we as Christians, we should stand out from the crowd. Our work ethic and our integrity ought to be head and shoulders above everybody else, because the character traits of a Christian, stuff that we are commanded to do in the Bible, should put us above everybody else. We're commanded to show respect to everybody. We're told to obey our masters and work diligently. Philippians 2:14 says, do all things without complaining and disputing. We are told not to complain. How many people complain? Pretty much everybody. Philippians 2:4 tells us to look out not only for our own needs, but also for the needs of others. So we're supposed to put others' needs ahead of our own. In the book of Romans, it tells us, do not think highly, associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. All these character traits should put us up towards the top, and people should admire that in us, and we should rise to the top. So we see all these people rising to the top here. Let's keep going here. So verse 10. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. Now, this is kind of interesting right here. We don't know at this time that the Jews are persecuted over there in Persia. They're about to be really quick, but up until now, we really haven't heard anything about it. Most of the time, there's never a reason to hide our faith, is there not? Jesus said, "Whoever confesses me before men, him I will confess before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him I will deny before my Father in heaven. For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him the Son of Man will also be ashamed." Paul says, Romans 1:16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek." Most of the time, there's never a reason to hide our faith. There might be a few circumstances where if you're just trying to, start up a conversation with them, but most of the time, there's never a reason. But for some reason, Mordecai had told Esther, "Do not tell anybody you're a Jew." So, verse 11, "And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her." Esther was basically a child to Mordecai. He raised her as his own. He loved her. He's worried about her. Verse 12, "And each young woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months preparation." 12 months, that's a long time. Why the long time? Well, most people, a lot of commentators say they wanted to make sure none of these women were pregnant if they were going to be queen. So that's why they gave them so much time. Sounds like a plausible reason. According to the regulations for the women, for thus were the days of their preparations apportioned: 6 months with oil and myrrh, 6 months with perfume and preparations for beautifying women. They pretty much had a 12-month spa treatment is the way you read the Bible here. Verse 13, "Thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarter to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shaggaz, the king's eunuchs, who kept the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called her by her name." This all sounds great until you think of the consequences of it. You get to live in the palace, you get 12, a whole long year of spa treatment. But think about this. They went from the virgin's quarters, went to the king's, then they went to another house, the concubine house, who was headed by another person. There's potential for these women to never be called before the king again and basically live a lonely life the rest of their life right here. So, verse 15. "Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her." Again, there was something about Esther that just people loved. "So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti." All the women were beautiful. So what set Esther apart? I'm going to say that inner beauty. From a little orphan girl to a queen, we always see these lowly people in the Bible rising to the top. Esther must have had an inner beauty that the king just loved. Verse 18, "Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther." This is now the 4th banquet feast that we read about in the book of Esther, and we're only 2 chapters in. "For all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king." Some translations, I believe the ESV says they actually gave a tax holiday. He forgave everybody their taxes for a year just because he found his queen, and now they're holding this huge celebration for it. The king's in a good mood again. Verse 19, "When virgins were gathered together a second time." Wait, they just brought 400 virgins in and had this huge contest. The audacity of this guy. Now he's like, you know what? That was such a good idea. Let's do it again. "When virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate." So now it appears Mordecai has actually risen to a place of influence. Before he was just pacing around in front of the women's quarter. Now notice that Mordecai is actually sitting within the king's gates. It appears Mordecai now has a place of influence amongst the kingdom. Verse 20, "Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. There's another good character trait of Esther, obedience. Mordecai, basically her father told her to do something, and she did it. Verse 21, in those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gates, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthon and Tersha, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Now, these king's eunuchs, we don't know what they're mad about, but they're mad about something. So mad that they're planning on killing the king. Let's see what happens. Verse 22. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. This is just an example of God, the providence of God. God enabled Mordecai to hear their plans so that he could tell Esther, who told the king, so that later on the king will show favor to Mordecai. It will all come into play later. Verse 23, and when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed. Now this is interesting. When Mordecai said something, what did the king do? The king actually investigated it to find out that it was true. Later on, Haman's going to come to the king and make a request, and the king's like, oh yeah, just do whatever you want. I don't care. The king actually, investigated into the matters which were told him. So when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on gallows. I believe King James Version here is going to say hang on a tree. NIV and NLT are going to say impaled on a pole. That's the correct thing right here. Impaled on a sharp pole. Just think human shish kebabs. If you want a picture of what it actually is, you'd have to Google Haman's gallows or Persian gallows, and they actually have relic pictures of these people impaled on poles. That's what the Persians did to people to make sure nobody did anything again. Like I said, they struck the fear in people. Just think human shish kebabs, and that's all you need to know. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So wait, that's it? There's no reward? Mordecai just saved the king's life, and he doesn't have a huge parade for him and a celebration. He doesn't even appear to give him a thanks, does he? It's coming later on. So we're done with Esther chapter 2. Esther is now queen, and Mordecai has saved the king's life. Next week, we're going to be introduced to Haman in chapter 3. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you the same time, same place next week. Bye.